Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's free webinar all about conflict competence for leaders. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm the founder and CEO of UK Mediation and post-Brexit also of EU Mediation Limited. So just a quick word about us. We started this 24 years ago now as a way of bringing to the market, bringing to the mediation world some of the ideas I'd had around conflict, and especially thinking about the psychology of conflict. So what we are all about here at UK Mediation and EU Mediation is looking at the resolution of conflict on the basis of trying to understand the people who are in conflict as a means to resolving the disputes they may have, particularly in the workplace, but in all sorts of other arenas as well. So what we do is we work with disputes, interpersonal conflict, and all sorts of fallouts, workplace grievance type issues, problems with communication breakdown, as well as working with families who are trying to stay together, and with commercial disputes, taking this angle of, if you lift the lid on conflict, what's actually going on there, and to try and understand the people who are in dispute as a way to bringing those disputes to a close. So that's what we do. Today, we're talking about what lessons leaders can take from the work that we and others have done over the last few years. And in the last 24 years, I think it's fair to say we've come across quite a few conflicts. So I want to talk today about some of our insights really into conflict and the kind of competencies that leaders might aspire to. So great to have you all join us today. I'm just having a look at, we have people from as far-flung places as East Africa, a lot of people from the UK, some people we've trained and qualified, some people we haven't yet. A lot of people from mainland Europe as well, probably got to us through EU mediation. Just a very quick word about that. It's something we set up post-Brexit so that we could continue to work with our partners in the larger EU institutions. So we do quite a lot of work across mainland Europe, and through EU mediation we're able to continue that work despite Brexit. So today, what we're going to be doing is looking at what we understand by this term conflict competence. I want to sort of lay it parallel to these ideas about management competencies and think about conflict competence as an example of a management competence. Think about where conflict comes from, something to do with the origins of conflict, the genesis of conflict, what's it all about, and if we can start to understand that, we can better start to understand how we might resolve it. And then some practicalities around conflict competence. And I want to give you a couple of snippets from our ideas and some of the the training ideas that we get across around conflict competence, particularly in two ways: dealing with conflict between you and one other person, and dealing with conflict between two other people as well. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. But as we go along, if you can use the chat box, if you've got a comment or a question, pop it into the chat box. I'll try and keep an eye on that. My colleague's scanning it as well, and I'll try and address it as we go along. But if you prefer to wait till the end, I'll leave some time. I'll speak for about 40 minutes today, and then I'll leave some time at the end. If you don't want to do that, you can just email us, and there's the address in the chat box, so you can use that instead. Email a question, and we can address that after the webinar finishes. So let's start with the definition. What do we mean by conflict competence? Well, let's go right back to the beginnings of management theory. And Henri Fayol, some of you management students would know, Henri Fayol was a mining engineer around about the turn of the last century. And he inherited a lot of mines, a lot of people to manage, a lot of dangerous processes to manage. And he started to ask the question about what do we mean by management? And he founded some of the earliest management theory around about the same time in the sort of 1910s, in the early 1900s. People were working on this idea of scientific management theory, but Fayol's management theory was very much to do with the four functions of management, as he put it. So from Fayol's perspective, way back in the 1900s, early 1900s, he said what we do as managers is four things. So we have to plan. We have to plan decisions that are coming. We have to plan for resources. We have to plan for people power. Risk management as well was one thing he talked about planning for. we have to organise. So when you've got a lot of resources, people, machinery, minds to mine, then you need to organise everything. You have to coordinate everything across time and across location in order that the whole thing gets managed. His third function of management, he said, was about leading, motivating employers to achieve goals. So setting an example, leading from the front, making sure people are motivated to do the goals that hopefully they have contributed to. So Fayol was even interested in this idea of sort of positive motivation of workers, which was quite a radical thing at the time for the 1900s. Henri Fayol really led the way in that as well. And the fourth one for his was about monitoring and evaluating, make sure you're doing the job. And ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to do, and ensure that all their planning, leading and organising is actually having the desired effect. So there needs to be an element of control as well. So there's Henri Fayol, 125 years ago. So let's bring it slightly more up to date. And there's a general sort of sense around management competencies now that we're talking more about sort of 6 kind of things, bringing it up into the 21st century. So just to nip across the pond for a moment and look at what the American Management Association says about management competencies. Okay, we've got management and leadership skills, communication skills, skills in collaborating, critical thinking, never assuming that you're doing it right, or noticing when you are. Finance skills, of course, managing your budgets, managing the money in your purse, and project management skills. So very quick skip across that pond to say that there are 6 competencies defined there by the American Management Association. Now let's push that boat out just a little bit further and look at some things I came across to do with management competencies from Indeed. So Indeed had something to say about it. Don't worry, this will be the last one. 11 management competencies. Here we go. I've rearranged the order slightly. You'll see why. But the 11 from the Indeed perspective are about interpersonal communication, motivating other people, communicating and writing. I like that one. Honesty and integrity of the leader, problem-solving ability, developing other people, having vision and planning abilities or competencies in having a vision, communicating it really, and then planning how to execute that vision. Creativity and innovation, being able to delegate, great one, that one. Valuing diversity. And before I give you number 11, you might guess what it's going to be, but just take a look at that little collection there. So these are considered to be modern leadership competencies, and in particular, bringing it into the 21st century, like I say, the idea of vision and creativity perhaps wasn't around in Henri Fayol's industry or in his time. And also I think the things about motivating others and communicating well are interesting in terms of a 21st century perspective. The 11th one is conflict resolution. So we have a mention of conflict resolution from Indeed in terms of a leadership competency. So the excellent leader might or should be able to tick these 11 boxes, that he or she should have an insight and a competence in all of these areas. Okay, talking of written communication, I just spotted a typo in number 8, so we'll go back and think about our written communication while we're at it as well. Conflict resolution, is it important? Is it an important thing to be able to spot, anticipate, head off, and resolve and manage conflict within your organisation? Can we consider that this is an important competency? Well, let's have a look. How important is this thing? So, again, pulling out some stats, I found a thing from the Myers-Briggs company. Interesting report just from last year, late last year. I think it was about September. And you can also find some interesting stats, if anybody wants to delve into this a bit further, from the CIPD in particular. CIPD do occasional reports on conflict at work. Very interesting perspective on how prevalent it is, and particularly how much it impacts on managers' time and an organisation's resources. Okay, so CIPD, some good stats. I was quite interested in this one as well because they've had some successive research where they've done a research project and then looked again a few years later to see how things have changed. According to this research from late last year, managers are spending over 4 hours a week dealing with workplace conflict. Okay, so there's a tenth of an average working week, or a little bit less, dealing with workplace conflict. Okay. About a quarter of people who were surveyed, there's quite a large sample size with this survey as well, about a quarter of those believe that their managers handle conflict either poorly or very poorly. That's quite damning. 1 in 4 people say that their managers handle conflict either poorly or very poorly. Not great. And then with this idea of successive studies, so they did a 2008 study. So there's 14 years ago. And in that case, it was just under 30%. So about 29% of people reported that they have to deal with conflict either often, very often, or all of the time. So just under 30% when they did it a few years ago have to deal with conflict often, very often, or all the time. That's now up to 36%. So that's gone up quite significantly. I think it's a pretty large sample size, so I think that's fairly valid, a fairly reliable result to look at. So what do we say? We say that about a quarter of people have that much conflict to deal with, and the amount of time that people are having to spend on resolving workplace conflict has gone up significantly. Bit of speculation about that. We find people's expectation in the workplace is different from our experience of doing this for 24 years or so. We find that COVID and lockdown and blended working, hybrid working, furloughing, the increase in working from home, remote working, etc., that has had an impact on conflict. We have had more work as a consequence of what's happened, both during COVID and lockdown and also post-COVID. We've just been looking at some stats. There was a real spike in the number of disputes that we came across just post-lockdown. I think possibly when people were coming back to work, possibly things that had been stored up during lockdown and during the course of the whole pandemic. But in essence, looking at this late last year, it's gone up by a significant amount, gone up by about a quarter, just under a quarter, I would say there, from 29% to 36% of people who have to deal with conflict a lot of the time. Okay, let's have a think about conflict then. Take the lid off it a little bit and think about how conflict comes about. What's it all about? In your workplace, as well as in most workplaces, you probably find, including all of our friends who are here today, both the UK and East Africa and all points north and south, it's about addressing contentious topics, especially where there are issues to do with differences in people's values or needs or priorities. You could probably look at all the workplace disputes you've ever had and say, okay, a lot of them are attributable to personalities that are impacted by different values, people who are impacted by different needs, and roles and positions in the organisation that have different priorities. So when you have this clash of values, needs or priorities, that tends to be the source of most contention in the workplace. This is where the contentious topics tend to arise. In terms of the settings in which conflict arrives, you'll find it's either in written communications, particularly things that are misinterpreted, misunderstood, people trying to use irony, humour, sarcasm in emails. I think we've got the hang of giving that a very wide berth these days. But in meetings, perhaps in remote meetings as well, we find there's a particular way to try and structure your remote meetings so you can avoid that kind of conflict. But meetings, written communications, and it can be in either spontaneous verbal interaction, verbal exchanges, the chat in the corridor, so to speak, or it can be in pre-planned verbal interaction as well. This is where conflict arises. Then I just want to look at this in terms of two particular poles, if you like, where conflict can arise. So it can be in resolving your own disagreements with someone else, or it can be in terms of resolving disagreements between two other people. So this is sort of the two-pronged thinking around conflict in the workplace. It can be between me and someone or between two other people, and we take a view on that. We try and sort of treat those two things. There's some overlap, but we try and look closely at the differences between those two things as well. So here's where conflict comes from. How do we deal with it? Well, we all deal with it quite differently, and the skilled manager, the very competent leader, a flexible approach to conflict. It's not one size fits all with conflict. Our own style needs to be adaptable, and perhaps the people that we lead need to try and get the hang of being adaptable around conflict as well, because there are different styles with which we might address conflict. Though some of you will be familiar with this idea. It comes from an instrument called the Thomas Kilmann instrument. Quite an old thing, goes right back to the 70s, but very useful in terms of thinking about how do we address conflict? What does it mean to be adaptable around conflict? Are there different ways to approach different kinds of disputes and different kinds of individuals? Okay, so let's have a look at this graph. I won't burden you with too much science today. It is Friday. Along the bottom axis there, the x-axis, we have the idea of assertiveness. This is around how much concern a person has for their own needs, for themselves. How much do they see their own needs as being important? So right down the zero end of the x-axis there, the bottom axis, you might say that that individual has no concern for their own needs. Perhaps you could say a complete lack of self-esteem. My needs don't matter. And then up the top end, up the far end of the x-axis, there we can say that this is somebody who has a very, very high degree of concern for their own needs, perhaps verging on narcissism. Right up there, it's all about my need. Up the side there, we have the y-axis is the idea of cooperativeness, and this is concern for others, how much you recognise other people's needs. So again, right down the bottom of that, you would have no concern for other people's needs. And right at the top, we could call it sociopathy. And right up the top there, you would have a very high degree of concern for other people's needs. So this is the very altruistic, very other-focused person right up the top there. And you can imagine plotting on there all sorts of ways of dealing with conflict, which is exactly what Thomas and Kilmann did back in the 70s. So let's have a look at what we come up with. So if I have a relatively low concern for my own need, but a high concern for others' needs, I may well accommodate, I may well give way and say, that's fine, we've got a disagreement, have it your way, I concede. If we're collaborating, perhaps there's a balance here about having a high concern for my need and a high concern for your need. So actually where we meet is in a place where we're going to put our heads together and try and figure out how we can collaborate here and make sure that you get what you need and I get what I need. Right down the bottom, by contrast, we would say if neither party in a conflict is very concerned for their own need, then they're going to shrug and walk away. It would be a rather avoidant style. So where we say it doesn't matter, we're not going to have the argument, we'll just deflect and pretend it's not happening. Up the top there, where I'm highly concerned for my needs and not too bothered about yours, I'm going to get what I want, we could say that's a very competitive place to be. And in the middle, if we're trying to sort of find a way that I can more or less get what I want, you can more or less get what you want, that we cut things in half, we split the difference, we'd call it compromise. What we are after in a highly competent way of dealing with conflict is to try and achieve, a lot of the time, the idea of a collaborative outcome. The idea is a collaborative outcome. So a lot of the time, as a competence for leaders, what you're trying to do is have a collaborative approach to conflicts so that I can get what I need as the leader, and you, team member, report, colleague, manager, organisation as a whole, you can also get what you need. So it's that ongoing work based on dialogue, based on negotiation, based on having a good deal of empathy between the parties who are in conflict to try and establish exactly what you need and trying to communicate well in a non-competitive way what I need, and trying to figure out in our dialogue how we can both get exactly what we want. This is the collaborative approach. It's not to say there's anything wrong with the other approaches. So what happens with the other approaches is actually we can choose sometimes to avoid a conflict, and don't we all? So when somebody cuts you up in your car at the traffic lights, okay, they're being highly competitive. They want to get in the queue in front of you. You could compete with them. You could try and get back in front of them, or you could shake your fist at them, flash your lights, do whatever it is we do these days, or you could just avoid it. You could accommodate them, let them have their way, or you could just look the other way, turn your radio up and pretend there's no conflict going on at all. Okay, and we could give lots of examples around this graph for how you might occasionally choose a different approach to conflict. And it's a good idea sometimes to compromise, actually. But ultimately, in terms of the bigger decisions, in terms of the more important things, in terms of exercising a high level of competence as a leader, what we're after is a collaborative approach. Okay, so moving on a bit, let's get practical. That's the theory. Let's talk about 3 different areas of conflict and where you might like to try and enhance your competence as a leader in some quite particular areas. So we've done the theory, here's the practice. Somebody comes at you, all right, I'm using very vernacular language here, but when somebody's trying to, is really sort of engaging in a conflict-ridden conversation with you. So somebody comes barging through your door, or stops you in the corridor, or approaches you as you get on your bicycle or car outside and has something contentious to raise with you. Okay, let's not start with problem solving. Let's not start with saying to that person, okay, what's the problem here that needs to be solved? Let's do this, let's do that. What do you reckon? Often it's about people being listened to feel heard and to feel that they're part of the solution. So whenever somebody initiates a dispute, conflict, something contentious with you, give them a good listening to first. Find out exactly what it is they're on about and find out exactly what it is they need. We say this so many times to people around all sorts of disputes, not just workplace, but neighbour disputes, disputes within families, commercial disputes. Don't start with the problem solving. Give them a good listening to first. There's a little acronym here that we use. It's borrowed from, it's in many, many places, it's out there, is LEAP. So listening to people first, looking for the signs to get a good understanding of what this person is trying to say to you, what it is they actually need. Empathizing, trying to step into their experience, trying to put yourself in their shoes to understand where they're coming from and how their need is being expressed and what that need really is. Asking for more information, trying to ask and acknowledge where they're coming from, and only then going into problem solving. So what we are inclined to do is to plea. We're inclined to try and problem solve first and then maybe do some listening, empathizing, asking. What you need to do is to look and listen first. Express empathy, make that person understand and truly believe and know that you are able to sort of see what their problem is, trying to see what the deficit in their need is, because a resolution to any conflict is where both sides get their needs met in that collaborative place, and only then doing problem solving. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is when you need to raise something difficult with another person. So as leaders, we quite often have to raise things with reports, with team members, with fellow leaders, with our management. So something difficult needs to be raised. Something difficult, what I mean by that is something that may be contentious. It may represent something that potentially could spill into a conflict. Okay, and in terms of our competence, might be a good idea to think about the 4WH, as they say. The 4WH is what, when, where, why of the conversation. So we might ask questions like this when I'm about to raise something difficult. Might be something mundane, like around somebody's timekeeping, personal habits, the way they communicate. Might be something a little more in-depth, like an aspect of their performance. Might be something to do with their ability to hit objectives, whatever it is. Something that's difficult, potentially contentious. Let's think about the 4WH. So what's going on? I want to get my facts straight. So back to that mundane example, if I need to speak to somebody about timekeeping, I'm going to need to know what times they have been coming into work and what times they have been leaving. If I'm challenged on that, I need to have my ducks in a row, as we say. I want to check that I can back things up. If it's around objective setting, if it's around somebody's written communication, for example, I need to get my facts straight, make sure you know what you're talking about, so when challenged, you can actually back it up. When do we do it? When do we raise difficult things to other people? Sooner the better, but leave enough time to do your preparation. Perhaps just breathe and go for a walk around the block first before you have this difficult conversation. Nip things in the bud. There is a common misperception that if you leave conflict alone, it will go away. It doesn't work. Our experience is quite the opposite. We need to be able to feel confident enough to drive into people's conflict situations, to drive into the difficult conversation. Address it as soon as you can, but make sure you've got enough time to do your preparation. Where should we do it? Neutral settings, when you want to raise something difficult with another person. Walk and talk is good. It's an old thing about walking and talking with somebody. One thing is, it can feel less contentious because you're not eyeball to eyeball. If you're walking alongside somebody, then actually it's a lot easier. There's something to do with keeping your pulse rate up, keeping the breathing up, being able to address a difficult topic with somebody without having to eyeball them, and where the two of you are actually moving. It feels just an easier, more natural way to have a conversation. A little aside, there's a friend of mine who's a social worker, and she often has to raise difficult things with some of the teenagers who are in her care. She says, I take him for a drive. So we find an excuse to drive to the shop, because the teenager then can be looking out the front of the car. They don't have to be looking at me. I'm not looking at them. I'm hopefully watching the road, she says, and we can have quite tricky conversations, and also say that by the time we get back, we'll stop talking about this. She said, I have some of the most magical conversations with some of the young people in her care when we go for the drive, rather than saying, can you come in a minute, I need to speak to you. It's a bit too challenging for some people, and not just young people, all sorts. Okay, and then why? Do I really need to have this conversation? We need to sort of think about risks and benefits. What do I stand to gain by having this conversation? What do I stand to lose if I don't have this conversation? Just weigh that up a little bit. It can be a good idea to rehearse difficult conversations, can be a good idea to run it past a trusted colleague and check what you're about to say, and think about, really, do I need to have this conversation or not? Okay, so I said a rule of three here. So the first one was around when somebody comes at you and wants to raise something contentious. The second one is when you need to raise something difficult with another person. And the third thing I want to mention today in this part about practicalities is when you need to facilitate a conversation between two other people. So this is sort of using resolution skills, mediation skills with a small m. And the idea here is that what we need to do as the third party who's going to try and resolve or facilitate a resolution between two other people is to retain two things first: our impartiality and a focus on the future. So our impartiality is extremely important. It's the hardest thing to get right. We can teach you, anybody can teach you a model of how to approach conflict resolution in 5 steps, 6 steps, 7 steps. Anybody can teach you a set of skills. I could show you the set of mediation skills on one piece of A4. Doing it is very difficult. Doing it well is also difficult. And one of the most difficult parts in terms of a competency for leaders here is retaining your impartiality. We're often too close to situations. We often have a judgment about rights and wrongs. We often have maybe a different history with one of the two parties than with the other. We may be short of time. There's lots and lots of reasons why it's hard to be impartial. This is the bit that needs working on in order to achieve this particular competency. Okay, so we need to stay impartial. We need to focus on the future rather than doing a forensic analysis of the past and who's right and wrong and what the evidence would suggest. Treat both people equally, obviously, comes with that. And what we like to do, is to hear from individuals first before bringing them together. So I want to know from each individual's perspective what's going on here. I want to exercise, if you like, something like the leap. I want to do some listening. I want to empathise with each party's predicament. I want to ask and get some more information. And then the problem solving is, okay, let's get together and you two are going to have a conversation, because what's very important in all of this is that we let the parties lead on the terms of the resolution. Okay, so it needs to be their solution. It needs to be that they come up with the answer, the way to bring the dispute to an end, because only then are they going to put their shoulder behind that resolution, try and make it work. They have to be invested in an outcome if they're going to make that outcome happen. It's no good me telling them what's going to happen. In the case of interpersonal disputes, if it's around a problem with a budget or something to do with how we complete a project, or bring a practical task to a conclusion, then maybe I'll need to provide some input or expertise. But when it's an interpersonal matter, when it's about people falling out around communication style, around personal habits, around how they interact with each other, then it's really important that they lead on the terms of the resolution. So that in one slide, 4 bullet points, is very, very quickly how we would facilitate a conversation between two others. Obviously, quite a bit more we could say about that, but that's the headlines. So what I've looked at there is 3 types of conflict then. when somebody comes at you, when you need to have a difficult conversation, and when you need to facilitate a conversation between two other people. Just before I go on, we've had a comment from Francis, thanks very much, who says, where being right and having proof come into play against feelings. So I think what you're saying there is sort of, if you like, facts versus feelings, Francis. So in terms of being able to prove something versus feelings, okay, well, facts is a great question, actually. Facts are facts, Francis. So take the mundane example again. Somebody has a poor attendance record, they're often late, they're often going home early, taking extended lunch breaks. I want to get my facts straight before I raise that with somebody. However, if it turns out that some very compelling, very difficult reason why, and having employed people for 35 years or so, I can say there's plenty of instances where really I could make a snap judgment based on the facts, but actually when I get to hear from that person about what's really going on in their life and hear the emotional impact of what's going on in their life, and when they hear from me about my need to treat people fairly, or my need to make sure the job gets done, or that there's some adherence to the company rules, actually we can probably find a good place to resolve that conflict. Maybe we don't, but quite often we do. So I think, Francis, if you're talking about balancing reason and emotion, I think there is a need for balance. Sometimes the facts are the facts and we need to act. Sometimes it's just about people's experience and emotions. And in that case, we need more of a collaborative, emotional focused solution. So it's about that balance, but it's a very good point. Okay, let's move on. I don't want to do a sales thing here. So what I'm going to say is training. How do you instantiate these competencies? Now, it might be programs that you run internally already. It might be that you want to add to your internal programs an element of conflict competence. It might be that you want to seek external training from us or somebody else. So what I want to do is talk about how we view, on the basis of 24 years experience, how we would view a typical training need analysis if you're trying to build conflict competence for leaders. It might be something you do for yourselves. It might be something you seek out online. It might be something you look for an external agent to provide. But we would say that if you're trying to sort of do masterclasses or workshops around this kind of thing, think about doing it this way. Our programs, are about equipping leaders with the skills to address your most commonly encountered conflict situations. You might do something similar for yourselves. Let's have a look at what this might be. Conflict resolution skills, a more generic way of looking at that thing I was saying about dealing with conflict when somebody approaches you, or you have to approach somebody, and conflict between two other people. So a one-dayer around conflict with you and one other, or conflict between two others. Okay, so a grounding. This one, Confident Conversations, is more about how you can stay in control of a difficult interaction, where you set an objective for a conversation, and then you're able to carry that out confidently and have a more positive discussion around any sensitive topic at all. So this is really about the conversation that needs to be had, that you may either not know how to do or you don't feel confident to do. And this is a really important thing when we're talking about competencies. It's not, if you like, it's not the whole picture to say, here's some skills, here's a formula, here's a step-by-step approach for how you might deal with a difficult conversation. It's also about confidence. It's also about feeling the inclination to walk towards those difficult conversations and deploy the skills that you've been taught. So what we're trying to do in our approach, and I imagine it might be similar for your own approach, is to say there's a combination of competence and confidence. And it's important to pay equal attention to both of those two things. The third one is about managing the hard to manage, pardon the stereotype, but in the case of people who seem to take up a disproportionate amount of time, of your time, this course would address that particular thing. And in terms of looking at how you would approach an individual who seems to take up a lot of your time. Skills and confidence, how to manage the harder to manage team member and report, how to make the most of the very limited time that you have. Okay, so this is about managing the hard to manage, a one dayer. And again, you might have something like this that you do yourselves internally. And then the other one here is about chairing contentious meetings. With the greater use of video conferencing with Zoom and Teams, etc. There seems to be more contention at meetings, face-to-face meetings as well, but where there's due to be a high level of contention or disruptive conduct or behaviour that might need to be addressed, could be with your service users or customers, could be just with team members or reports, might be anything to do with running your organisation. But how do you better chair a meeting at which there is likely to be contention? Okay, there's another one-day programme there. So like I say, I'm not here to do a sales job for you, but if you're thinking of how to train your managers, how to enhance your leaders' competence in terms of how they deal with conflict, you might find that breaking it down in that way is something useful. Thinking about all the places where conflict might arise, there are some general principles that would apply to a lot of these areas, but if you can break it down into those particular areas, you might find it's a good way to analyse that training need and hopefully to address it as well. Okay, that is a large part of what I wanted to say to you today. So we're just going to invite any questions. We've got one here from Christina, who says, how far should a manager go when dealing with a difficult employee? At what point should we say enough is enough? Well, that's a really good question, Christina, because I think we start with the informal approach, start with the low-level informal approach, the humanistic approach, really. Listen to that person, see what's going on, see if between you and them you can figure out a solution in private without having to note everything, record everything, put things on their supervision file. Take that as far as it's going to go. At some point there needs to be a line. So what I would suggest is that there might be some stage at which you speak to your HR colleagues as well, and maybe there's an issue to do with that person's capability or performance, or they're impacting on the code of conduct of the organisation in a negative way. So actually there is a line, but give plenty of opportunity for the informal approach. I'd like to give you a very accurate figure. I would estimate that round about 2 out of 3 disputes that we have come across, many thousands of disputes we've come across in the last 24 years, can probably be nipped in the bud. And when things are not nipped in the bud and when they go into a more formal, more extended process, quite often when you look at those, you can easily say that could have been nipped in the bud. You've missed an opportunity. So in essence, I would say, Christina, exhaust all possibilities for informal resolution before we get the big stick out the cupboard and start deploying the more formal process. But there are employees, reports, team members, colleagues, managers for whom the softer, more humanistic approach actually is not what they're after. They maybe want a battle. They want a more competitive approach to a conflict, and I think there are occasions on which that should be deployed, that should be used. Okay, so I'm just looking out for any further questions before we sort of wrap up for today. And thinking about, there's one from Lynn. So Lynn says, do you have any experience of how a manager or leader might deal with a situation where a staff member is emotionally triggered by the manager? I'd really want to explore that one, I think, Lynn, where there's something about that manager's person that triggers that individual. I'd want to explore that potentially with a mediator, actually. There's a good example, now you mention it, Lynn, of where it might be hard for, supposing it was me, and supposing there was a report of mine who was in some way triggered by me. And I've tried my best to explore it with them, but every time I speak to that person, he or she kicks off or becomes upset or finds that they can't easily speak to me. Okay, that would be a good occasion on which to get an impartial third party to try and offer a resolution meeting between us, because you have, in an impartial third party, call them a mediator or a resolution facilitator, is a term that some people have used. One thing that the mediator does is they hold up a mirror to the interaction that's going wrong. Okay, so if an interaction is going wrong between me and a team member or a report, to have a mediator or an impartial third party, just let us see what's going on between us. There's probably things I'm unaware of. Be very quick to acknowledge that. There might be things that other individual is unaware of as well. So part of the value of having that impartial third party is really so that we can see what's happening in our interaction and hopefully do something about it. So grand question, that one, because the answer is use a mediator. Okay. And I think that's our questions for today. So if you've not had a chance to, there's a little adjunct there from Lynn who says, and or where they don't respond well to feeling managed and there are perceived control issues. Yeah, sure. So maybe it's about my management style. I need to know about that, and having an impartial third party help me see what's going on in the interaction from a more removed place would be would be the answer. The answer to that one, Lynn. So here we go. There's our questions. Just very quick mention of a forthcoming webinar. We have a whole program of webinars. My colleagues popped a link into the chat box there so you can see what's coming up, and we can register for future webinars right there. The next one we've got is in October, on Friday 20th October. It's about fostering positive conflict. So next month's webinar, I'll be looking at the differences between sort of positive and negative conflict. There's not only two categories, there's a continuum, but how can we transform potentially damaging disputes into something more constructive, and what's the role that mediation can play in all of this? So really just to refer back to Lynn's point. So if there's something going wrong, if this individual is saying they're triggered by my management style, there's something going wrong there, that's potentially damaging to not just our relationship, but the whole team. So what could we do about that, turn that into something more constructive by using an external mediator? So there we go. How can we foster positive conflict when things are going wrong between two individuals and turn it into something rather more positive, stop it going to a bad place? And that's Friday 20th of October. So we're finished for today. I've kept to time, amazingly. We love to keep in touch with you. Please check us out, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the usual channels. Check out the website. There's lots of free webinars in the archive on our website. If you look at the archive of webinars, you'll probably find some other stuff that may be of interest to you. If you've got a suggestion or idea for future webinars, you're very welcome to flag that up as well. Maybe you have a special interest, a special area of conflict that you particularly would like to hear about. Do let us know. And thanks very much for attending today. Thanks very much for your comments and questions. That's us done for Conflict Competence for Leaders. I hope it's been helpful. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.